go on their respective injuries? What can you tell us about where they're at on Tuesday?
Yeah, so generally they'll leave the concussion protocol till later in the week for Jake, but he's obviously moving around, and that's a really good sign. So hopefully he'll be right. And then Slaney's at Clarke, so they can take a while to settle, but the fact that he's up and moving is once again pretty good sign for his availability come Sunday.
Who makes the call on a call usually? Is it the player, or is there risk of further damage that they have to worry about?
Yeah, no, well, ultimately anything medical falls to the medical team, but that decision's always in consultation with the player and their history and whether they've managed that sort of thing before. So it's, as I say, you're on Tuesday, all things being equal, you'd envisage him being pretty close.
Is he sore? How sore is he?
Have you ever had a cookie?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're pretty sore. No, it's clearly, so it's a bit sore, but as I say, we've got a fair while to go, so should be right come the weekend.
Saturday afternoon sort of call?
Yeah, well, I think with Rory Slane, you're going to give him every minute possible to be available, and I'm sure the call will come slightly earlier than that, but we'll wait and see.
We spoke to Mitch yesterday. He said you hadn't reviewed the game. Can you share some insight into some sort of the conversation?
Yeah, no, we reviewed it. It was obviously any time you have a performance like that, you've got to face facts, and we were very poor in a lot of areas, and while we understand that improvement's not going to be linear and there's going to be bumps, when you have a significant bump like that, then there's no doubt you have to confront that and address some of those issues. So that was yesterday, and now today we move forward and look to what's next.
What did you address?
Well, clearly our defensive transition, our running defensively wasn't at the level, and Port Adelaide were able to own the corridor and move the ball far too freely. So that was probably the key issue. Our defensive intensity was really lacking. So disappointing, but as I say, we've got to move on pretty quickly.
Is it a blip that you sort of potentially stay and give the guys another chance to rectify, or?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it's a performance-based industry, and if you don't perform, then you put yourself under pressure. But equally, as I said, you want to assess form over a period of time, and a lot of those players who perhaps weren't at the level they wanted to be have been really strong contributors over a long period of time. So that discussion will be for later in the week.
Is that effort or structure, that sort of defensive transition?
Yeah, so sometimes you have effort moments, but clearly there's still great effort. If you look at obviously we track their work rate really closely, and they're still working, but probably just not at the appropriate time. Often you miss that moment to be switched on and alert and sharp defensively, and then you've got to work really hard to chase. And essentially that's what we spent our whole day chasing, instead of being proactive and aggressive and getting in the defensive mindset slightly earlier, and saving ourselves some of that running.
Is that experience? What's that a byproduct of?
No, well, it was across the board, so it wasn't just young players. It was some of our more senior players as well. So it's not purely experience, but for whatever reason on that day, we just didn't bring a defensive intent which was at the level necessary to compete.
Do you stick with this team, or do you expect some change?
Yeah, so equally that's basically a conversation for later in the week. But you just assess the performance, but you also assess what you need to win the next game of footy. So. At times you'll reach a threshold where you need to make change, but whether whether we are there yet is to be seen.
So who played well in the lead-up game that possibly?
Yeah, so the game before was a really open and fast affair because they played 16 aside, and so it was even though it was low scoring, there was a really high work rate. So what was pleasing in that game? Some of our key tools in terms of Frampton and Himmelberg gave really good contests, and that's obviously been a discussion point around the structure of the side. So they put their hand up and said, we're in form that can warrant selection if that's the way we choose to go. Down back, McPherson and Hamill were really strong, and then through the midfield, Scholl's been in pretty good form, and unfortunately Paddy Wilson hurt his shoulder really early in the game. His form line leading in had been really strong, but Miles Paholke is probably another who's been around the mark and is contributing really strongly on the track. So, but as I say, it's all to be decided later in the week.
6 or 7 names there. No mention of Rice. How was he?
Yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned Gibber, because down back, sometimes that is the challenge as an experienced player. We sort of rate their performance against a higher threshold. He was really solid. And I guess you sort of go, yeah, well, that's what we expect. But the reality is we need to acknowledge that was a really strong performance as well.
Hey, John, it's only round 2, but I don't know if you were ever a gambling man when you were allowed to gamble, but the bookies have the Crows right down to the bottom 2. Is that a fair assessment of this team, or do you think you're a better team than that?
Well, it's fair as at round 2 because that's what our performance suggests. But ultimately, we're really confident that we've got better performances in us than last weekend. I think in round 1 we brought great effort and great intensity and didn't get an outcome. On the weekend we were far from the mark, and it is a very small sample size, and our challenge is to make sure that in a month's time we're back in a place where we feel we are able to compete at a much better level.
You as a coaching group, do you have to remind players that you believe that they are better than what they've done so far? How does that work?
I think there's always great belief with personally, we know what these players can do, and we've seen what some of our young players can do. So I've got great belief that we can play a lot better footy than we did on the weekend. Yeah.
Party's available as of next week, is that right?
Yeah.
What hole has he left by not being here?
Well, I've filled it, and we didn't do very well, so it must be a fairly big hole. No, but he'll be back. He'll be back next week, which is great. I mean, ultimately, I've stepped into that role for a short period of time. But what I have seen there is that some of the more experienced leaders are really self-driven and self-motivated athletes, and they're really keen to bring that next group along. And so, in a lot of ways, my role was just to facilitate some of those discussions with the leaders of that forward group. So I know that Benny's champing at the bit to get back, and we really look forward to him being back part of our group.
It's the toughest task for you as a coaching group to have patience with what you've got?
No, I think, if you've been in footy a little while, you understand that the graph isn't always linear, and therefore, if you have a setback, you've got to address the issues that have caused that setback, but you also need to take a little bit of a longer-term view and be consistent in the way that you coach and make sure that you're not deviating rapidly because of one performance. So, we've got, as I said earlier, I've got great confidence in this group and our ability to compete.
The nature of the cattle, like you're incredibly young. The guys that are waiting in the wings are either with respect to the end or the beginning of their careers.
So the group is in a transition. There's no doubt about that. But that doesn't. I think we can perform at a much higher level than we did on the weekend, and I'm really confident that we will, regardless of where the list sits at this moment in time. So our first challenge is to make sure that we just get ourselves back up to that threshold of competitiveness, which I'm really confident we can do.
Does anyone in that review, anyone get a sort of good mark, pass mark, or some positives from players on the weekend?
You don't get too many on a performance like that, but I probably thought Brown's job on Robbie Gray, Talia with a hell of a lot of ball coming in on Dixon was pretty sound. So our defenders, as a collective, under a lot of duress, at times were able to stand up. Our forward line probably didn't get a lot of opportunity. The reality is, but ultimately, when you lose by that margin, it's all in really, and we just were poor as a collective. So I have individualised a couple there, but the reality is that as a team, we weren't at the level.
How do you assess Walter's game and his spotting out?
As I said, the forward group, in Q1, quarter one, we had some opportunity to compete and to win our share of ball. For the last 3 quarters, the reality is that there wasn't a hell of a lot of opportunity. So in terms of making a really hardline assessment on a lot of the forwards, it was challenging.
Just about the ruck coach, would you like to see Wally have a bit more support?
Yeah, I think ultimately, I felt that the ruck issue wasn't significant on the day. I felt like Riley was able to manage the workload fairly well, and therefore I think that discussion, which is an ongoing discussion clearly, is more centred around what we needed in terms of our forward structure rather than what we need in the ruck. The shortened game time is forcing all clubs to address that issue as to whether there's the value of having 2 genuine ruckmen in your team. So we'll continue to look at that clearly, but from my perspective, it's probably more what do we need from a forward line.